Well, I have to say, it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I'm particularly interested in getting to talk to you all about the work that I'm doing, not in helping me to communicate about what we do to readers who don't have the privilege of being part of the kinds of conversation that I know you guys regularly have here. And so what I hope you can do is, you know, in the discussion part at the end of the lecture, to kind of help me think about how this material can be useful and can be accessible, you know, out there in the wider world. I would also like to thank the Divinity School, the Classics Department, and the Robert Penn Warren Center, and Robert Penn Warren. And I particularly want to say just a silly, charming thing, which is that Robert Penn Warren has evidently experienced a bump on Amazon due to my book, Band of Angels. Now, why is that? You may or may not remember that he wrote a book of the same title, which I believe won the Pulitzer Prize. But he wrote it long enough ago that it's not selling like hotcakes currently. But it is experiencing a revival. And I noticed this because when I first wanted to give this title to the book, I really thought long and hard, because I thought, you know, I thought, of course, of the marvelous hymn that it comes from. But then I thought, if there's already a really important book that has that title, am I ever going to get to the point where, you know, people Google Band of Angels and find my book 4 pages in? But I'm happy to tell you that through assiduous effort, I have managed to get onto the first page when people Google it. And as I told you, Robert Penn Warren is benefiting, as it turns out, from the phenomenon. So that is happy news. I also want to say, and it's not just ruthless self-promotion, but really trying to get the word out about this very important cause of getting the world to know that Christianity is not about shutting down the agency of women or any other subordinate group within society, or any other minority, or any other group that is under fire. And I say that both for the sake of all of the kind of liberation, inclusionary, intersectional messages that I know you all to be involved with, but also on the strangely opposite side of trying to let the secular world. I'm teaching in England, where 4% of the country is actively involved in the state religion, the Church of England. You know, and I'm in a situation where the assumption is that if you are involved with Christianity, you must be against marriage equality, women's agency, any kind of minority group having any kind of voice. You know, that it's really wives be subject to your husbands and slaves be subject to your masters. So in that sense, it's, I think on both sides, it's really important to get the word out that the tradition of what might be called embodied resistance, or even just self-fulfillment in this particular religious tradition, really goes all the way back. And I think anybody who has talked to nuns or veiled Muslim women, or a wide variety of practitioners of some of the modern traditional cultures that are out there, will know that it's really a mistake to assume that agency can only happen within a sort of modern, individualistic kind of framework. And I feel very passionate about honoring that agency. So in a sense, I invite you to help me figure out ways to get that message out. What I want to do today is to talk about a single strand of the work that I did partly in the book Band of Angels, but also that I have been doing as ongoing work, which is looking at the women of early Christian Africa. It's a topic that is surprisingly little studied. I can't particularly tell you why. Maybe you can help me to understand that. But it's also a topic that doesn't quite have the shape that you might expect. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about where the north of Africa, what geographers call the Maghreb, fit into the Roman Empire and where women fit into that society. And then I'm going to walk you through three groupings of material that give us insight into different, as it were, different periods of Christian writing and thinking about women. I will be talking about women rather than gender for the most part, not for ideological reasons, just because it happens to be the topic. But I do think one of the things that's really interesting is the way that women as characters within literature become a focal point for certain kinds of missionary and certain kinds of rhetorical activity by Christian authors. So that theme of mobilizing heroines as either spokespeople or icons of vulnerability, of moral authority, that is going to come up again and again. So to start with, when we think about the women of Christian Africa, as with any other part of the empire, we have to be aware of the issues of social class. And I have to say that generally speaking, ancient historians, this image, I'm trying to give you a sense of different levels of cultural pretense and cultural achievement, but in fact this image is also a fairly high elite level of cultural artifact. But interestingly, although most of the texts that we have from the ancient world come from the elite classes, when we look at narrative representations of women, one of the things that's interesting is we find an unusually intense interest in lower class women, in slave women, and in the question of female enslavement. So that is a really interesting and kind of to me, surprising aspect of how early Christian writers treat the question of women. Okay. Does that work for you, lighting-wise? Okay. Do I have a kind of halo now? Okay. Good. All right. That's what we were hoping for. All right. So this has all been pre-planned. So what I'm going to turn to now is just a couple of minutes on where Africa sits in the Roman Empire and how its place in the Roman Empire changed or put specific pressures on Roman period Christians in that region. This is taken from Google Maps, and it is it's a map of the known Roman amphitheaters, and I want to talk to you for a minute about the amphitheaters of the Roman provinces as a space for representing and instantiating Roman power. Rome, as you probably know, a city in the Italian peninsula, by the turn of the two eras, by the year zero, as it were, had conquered the full range of the Mediterranean, and in some sense had managed to extend its empire to what could reasonably be called the known world. One of the ways they did that was through fantastically strategic work with the elites in the localities that they conquered. They really created a kind of pyramid scheme where elites felt that if they bought into the Roman project, they would get a kind of, a discount, as it were, price on the benefits of Roman power. And so they would co-opt the elites and have the elites do their dirty work for them to some large extent. One of the other ways that they managed to put very little resource into holding the provinces and to turn it into a real money-making operation to collect really massive taxes, was to use symbolic representations of power to create the understanding in the minds of provincial citizens and slaves that it just wasn't worth going up against Rome. And the amphitheater is one of the places that they did this. Interestingly, the amphitheaters themselves seem to have been fantastic pyramid schemes in that they, recent scholarship suggests that they were largely privately financed. And so in that sense, although they were, the power of Rome was being proposed and asserted, in fact, what they really were a vehicle for local elites to create a kind of hinge position for themselves where they're seen by the Roman authorities to be people who can mobilize crowds and control crowds, but at the same time they're seen by the crowds to be people who stand in on behalf of the Roman authorities. In the 2nd century, one of the crucial things that happens is there's a senatus consultum, a law is passed that allows the local owners of these arenas to buy common criminals from the imperial criminal staff, from the procurator of their province, to use them as low-cost, untrained gladiators in fights to the death in the arena, which were, of course, one of the most beloved sports. So in that sense, one of the things you find in Christian literature coming from the 2nd century onwards is this acute excitement and concern about the question of criminals being executed in the arena. These are people whom we remember as Christian martyrs, but what we have to remember when we think about them is that these people were first and foremost people who happened to be criminals. The evidence for the Romans persecuting the Christians actively and systematically is very weak before the year 303. And so in that sense, for the first 3 centuries, Christians, like so many others in the provinces, are falling foul of the law in various ways. And the problem is that if they fall foul of the law, they come into a legal system which often asks you to sacrifice to the tutelary god of the emperor as part of the process of being processed as a criminal. So in that sense, once you're in the maw of the beast, the fact that you don't like idolatry puts you in a category of particularly difficult criminals and lowers dramatically your chances of, coming out the other side. Assuming, that is, that you are one of the Christians who is willing to just stake their life on the refusal of idolatry, which is a question that is under debate. Not every Christian individual takes that view, and we'll be coming back to that. So I'm going to start with that in mind, with a pair of saints who are, I think, fairly well known now in the world of people who study early Christianity. The martyrs Perpetua and Felicitas, who were martyred according to tradition in the year 203. I say according to tradition because we have what seems to be a dated prison diary from Perpetua, but there's a scholarly debate about whether the frame story that surrounds the prison diary is contemporary or much later. So in that sense, her diary mentions events that can be dated to 203. So it's unless the diary's been doctored, and individually I don't think it has been doctored. I think it is a legitimate document from the early 3rd century. If it hasn't been if the diary hasn't been doctored, then the document is the first attestation of a Christian woman writing on her own behalf about what it is to be a Christian. And that's in Latin or any other language. I want to say before we go on that this issue of the first Latin writer coming from North Africa, in fact, Perpetua was the first female Latin writer, but the other first Latin writers of the male gender also come from North Africa. And if you really are trying to understand the Latin Christianity that eventually centers on Italy and Rome, the place you look for its origins is North Africa. Around the year 200, in Rome, for the most part, they're still speaking Greek in the Christian community, because the Christian community originates out of a Greek-speaking trader community in the city of Rome. So when we think of Latin Christianity, we're thinking about an African phenomenon. And I've had a fascinating experience talking with colleagues in the Maghreb about this fact in the last few years. And you know, any time somebody says to you, Christianity is a Western religion, you have to come back and say it's a religion from the Levant and the Maghreb. And that is just that. When we talk about Western European culture, we're talking about Tunisian culture. And I think that's a politically terribly important point, particularly at a time when Tunisia is struggling to find its place in relationship to both Europe and the Levant. And one of the questions that we'll come back to at the end of the talk is, in fact, how Africa passes out of the Roman Empire. And interestingly, and kind of sadly, I think that Christian women played a small but symbolic role in that process. So I've given you here a modern slide of the Tunisian village where Perpetua and Felicitas are believed to have originated from, and I really am. It's actually in a part of Tunisia that is very productive agriculturally, but the form of production is in antiquity was largely grain production, and what that means is a kind of labor that has a very is it a steep social pyramid or a flat one? Anyway, it's one where a very few landowners are exploiting massive numbers of workers. And one of the really interesting questions about Perpetua and Felicitas is where they fit in social location. We spoke earlier about the later frame story that surrounds Perpetua's diary that purports to talk about her death. That diary also talks about Perpetua as a woman of noble birth. Now, it happens that the diary itself implies very strongly that Perpetua is an unmarried concubine in a way that simply wouldn't be possible if she were a woman of high birth. So my view as a scholar is that the later frame story tried to move Perpetua up the social ladder in order to give a better heroine. And that's something that we see happening repeatedly in medieval saints' narratives, that bit by bit the women get younger and richer. The ideal heroine is a 12-year-old princess. And that's already true in ancient literature. And it's partly 12 years old, not for modern reasons, but because that was considered to be the age of marriage. You know, and a woman on the verge of betrothal is one of the top protagonists in ancient literature. So Perpetua, the frame story says that she was 22, so already it's letting her be old. But I think this question of her social location is a very rich and strange problem. I want to call your attention to a couple of things about what Perpetua herself says. One is that she repeatedly feels that her religious faith not only permits her, but it requires her to defy paternal authority. And that's something that I think is is very interesting. This idea that the claims of faith put you into a category of moral authenticity, but also a sort of, it gives you a legitimate way of suspending obligations that you may have accrued in your social location. I think that's a factor that doesn't get discussed enough when we talk about the appeal of Christianity, particularly when we look at this age range, which comes up again and again in ancient literature, of people who are at the age of moving from their parental house to their family of reproduction. You know, that hinge moment where people are trying to figure out what their obligations and accountabilities are going to be. The Christian writers see these people as not the ideal converts, but the characteristic individuals who are ripe for conversion. Perpetua also seems to be using her father to practice for her interrogation in front of the governor's representative. And I think that's really very interesting as well. She indicates that she sees an alignment between paternal authority in her community, the authority of her own father, and the authority of the state. Again, that's something that, that the Christian movement is actively trying to, at this stage in its development, is trying to throw up in the air. One of the things I've worked on in my scholarly work is I've been able to show that these storylines about adolescents challenging their parents tend to change over time, and as the church becomes more established, the children start obeying their parents more. It's fascinating. This idea of challenging the alignment of parental and state authority goes away. So, but it's not going to go away today. The other thing that probably many of you have heard of, and some scholars think this could be later, it's a 5th century mosaic, because it's a saint. Some scholars think it could be an image of Perpetua, but that is very much, it's not, I mean, to say it's in doubt is almost too weak. I've used it to illustrate, but we don't have images of Perpetua. One of the things that is fascinating about Perpetua, though, is that her own prison diary talks not only about defying her father, but also about dreams and visions in which she finds her, in one case she finds herself transformed into a male wrestler and wrestles with the Egyptian whom she later realizes, of course, was the devil coming to her in a dream. And this idea of gender inversion is something that's very, very powerful and powerful and compelling. And it's fascinating that the community of the early 3rd century was so excited about this and so happy with it. It's you know, it's not what you would initially expect, and I think we can come back in the discussion at the end to think together a little bit about why that was the case. I also want to call your attention to Felicity, and here I am completely cheating with the image because this is in fact a reasonably high-standing woman from the 5th century, but it just happens to be from a poorer community than the community that produced what I'm using as the Perpetua illustration. So please forgive my my cheating there. But for those of you who haven't read the Acts of Perpetua and Felicitas, and if you haven't, I encourage you to. They're in Muserillo's Acts of the Christian Martyrs, and these days you can find them very easily in the medieval internet sourcebook and all sorts of other places online. The second female protagonist of this story cycle, who appears only in the frame story, not in Perpetua's own visions, is Felicity, who is identified as a slave woman in her 8th month of pregnancy. And one of the things that is has been a tendency by later writers has been to assimilate, because they're two women, they stand out in a narrative that has a group of other martyrs who are men, but there are two women and they stand out, so let's connect them. And I've seen various treatments of the story, both medieval and modern, that assume that Felicity is the slave of Perpetua. Now, there's no evidence for that in the original material whatsoever. But forgive me. But what is interesting about this the story of Felicitas, in fact, is that it's part of a modest but substantial tradition of 2nd and 3rd century writing that argues that slaves are exemplary, can be exemplary Christians, and can be exemplary Christians even unto death. And some of these texts, not this one, actually comment really directly on, don't think that standing in the eyes of the world has any indication of what the value of the Spirit is going to be from this person's witness. So again, we've got this idea of resisting the alignment of worldly authority and the church witnessing against those worldly structures. I'll come again back to that point and talk a little bit about how that changes over time. But for the moment, what I want to do is just talk a little bit more about Felicitas. She's clearly in this narrative being portrayed as a kind of folk philosopher, and this idea of exemplifying the idea coming through from the Pauline letters of the Christ that lives within me. It is something that the writer who is telling the story of Perpetua and Felicitas's deaths is looking at them in slightly different ways, and I think that the issue of their legal freedom and enslavement is part of it. The narrator of the death account talks about Perpetua in the moment of her death up to the last being modest and wanting to cover herself, wanting to seem to be a proper and modest woman, whereas Felicitas, by contrast, is shown in the most vulnerable and the most, in a sense, courageous but also kind of humiliating situations of being represented in childbirth, this very strong idea of a kind of biological female power and vulnerability. And I think it's not a coincidence that it's the slave who is used as a character to portray an idea of womanhood that is balancing out the more modest and ladylike martyrdom that Perpetua is treated to. My own view as a scholar working on these texts is that the ladylike gestures of Perpetua in the arena probably are the writer reacting, perhaps instinctively, to the gender bending in her own document. That when she talks about herself being made naked and wrestling the Egyptian, it creates a kind of static that the writer is trying somehow to resolve. And I think there are lots more instances of that tension between the two narratives, but for the moment I'll stop there and we can perhaps come back to them in the discussion. The second pairing, I've given you just Monica of Tagaste here, but there are two important women in the Confessions of Augustine. The second, as you'll probably be aware, is nameless, the concubine with whom he produced his son Adeodatus. But what I want to do in talking about Monica and the woman that Augustine himself calls someone, he says, at that time I had someone whom I cared about. So we'll call her someone for the purposes of this discussion. Before going into talking about them, we've skipped forward over 200 years. We're in the late 4th century now, 380s. But Augustine's family is one of the best known families in the ancient world because of the Confessions. And yet, at the same time, Augustine is he's very coy in what he tells us about the women of his family. Certainly Monica is one of the great hagiographical characters of early Christian literature. His memoir of his mother in the Confessions is really very striking. And yet, it's clear that Augustine, as he's trying to talk through his mother's life after her own death, in some ways he's stylizing her story and he's subordinating aspects that don't fit his own status as the real protagonist of the Confessions. And I think it's really important to bear that in mind when reading this text. It's not particularly important for today, but I just want to remind you that he was, like many other men of his age, a colonial African educated first at the University of Madaura in Numidia, down there below Hippo Regius on the map, but who makes his way first to Rome and finally to Milan, where the imperial family are stationed at that time. So it's really, Milan is really the apex of kind of working your way up through the Roman system. And the way he talks about his mother really is stylized in a literary way that's very self-consciously modeled on the Aeneid and on the idea that every Roman hero is going, like Aeneas, to have to leave some woman behind in Africa crying. And it's just astonishing. But he talks very early in the Confessions, he talks about his education and how the idea of Dido being left by Aeneas was something that they were all taught to think about. And I think there's extraordinary work being done on the Aeneid in the medieval schoolroom. And I think there is extraordinary work to be done on the Aeneid in the ancient schoolroom, in terms of teaching boys to, because it was an educational system that was so much based on recitation and memorization of this poem, among other poems, but this was, the big enchilada. It's a poem that is so centrally talks about men learning to sacrifice the feelings of women for the sake of empire. And it's, of course that's what you would give your boys if you wanted them to grow up to, go out and kind of govern the world and, bash the natives about, up to the 1940s, I may add. And I have to say, my children who are being educated in England did their classical recitation last week. And, this passage is still alive, let us just say, in the British education system. But when Augustine talks about his own departure from Africa, he very actively evokes the idea of Dido weeping as Aeneas leaves him. And it's fascinating for a number of reasons that he does this. One, it makes perfect sense given the theme that he's already set up of Dido and leaving Africa and the requirements of empire. But of course, it's important for another reason, and that's that the real departure for Augustine is going to be his departure from Italy back to Africa. So there's an interesting thing that being set up in a way only to be subverted. But like all scholars through history, I'm getting kind of seduced by the interest of Augustine as protagonist, and I do want to talk about the women. So Monica's childhood. In Augustine's memoir of Monica, in Book 9 of the Confessions, he talks about her experience in a slave-owning household, and how, and he talks about the, interestingly, his first cue is not about the brutality of the slave owners towards the slaves, but it's of the righteous brutality of a slave nursemaid towards the children in her charge. And there's some interesting anthropological work has been done on the dynamics of child rearing, where child rearing is outsourced to lower status people, and the way in which those people are, on the one hand, acting as an authority on behalf of the parental class, but on the other hand, there's also evidence that there's a dynamic of, in a sense, taking out some of the frustrations of that position onto the children of the upper class. One of the things that we'll see later on is that this dynamic, in some sense, of slave-master relationships, I think Augustine has got a big shell game going, and we see later on in the same book of the Confessions, Augustine talks about when his mother married, she moved into a household where her the servants resented her her entry into the household, and one of the things that I think, and he talks about the good fortune that his mother was able eventually to put down these slave girls and to get them whipped. If you read that text with any kinds of interest in the power relations of the Roman provincial household, you start to find it quite disturbing, the way that that Monica is, in this narrative, is set against the slave women in the house. Certainly, it's good historical evidence for what really happened. I think there's no question about that. But on the other hand, you know, given all of these wonderful early Christian ideas about honoring slaves, you know, we've got a saint here who's, you know, in a position of being very, you know, exonerated may be the right word, for taking up against enslaved women. I suspect that part, and of course, as Augustine tells the story, it's all about her relationship with her mother-in-law. I suspect that the situation is rather more complicated, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But before I do, I want to bring out another aspect of Monica's, as Augustine sees it, Monica's sufferings, and in this case, for better or worse, I think we're inclined to come down on Monica's side. He talks about her experience of her husband's drunkenness and tendency to domestic violence. He claims that she was able, by behaving in an appeasing way, to keep him from violent behavior. Modern studies show that appeasing generally isn't a good tactic. And modern studies also show that adult male children of abused mothers carry tremendous anxiety and guilt about not having been able to do anything about it. The way Augustine handles the issue is, as it were, to sweep those kinds of issues under the carpet in an encomium of Monica's ability to manipulate a violent man. And I think Augustine has done much great good for the world, and quite a few problems as well in his legacy. This is one of the real problems, because it's one of the best known texts from the ancient world, and it has really left an unfortunate legacy. Something that's very interesting is contemporary papyri show that that wasn't how bishops actually on the ground were acting, at least not all of them. And Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 6903, which is one of the most marvelous and strange texts to survive from antiquity, is it's a deposition from a woman who has gone to the bishop to try to get her unbelievably violent husband to stop hurting not only herself, her children, and her slaves. And it's the bishops, along with the man's own kin, who are the ones who come in to try to put the situation in order. And there is quite a bit of other evidence to suggest that the clergy regularly did take it as part of their job to contain the domestic brutality that was probably the norm in Roman households. There is, I'm afraid, very little evidence that the clergy acted on behalf of slaves when they were not also getting in trouble that free people were experiencing. But at the very least, free members of the household, the clergy did see it as their duty to stop excessive domestic abuse. And I'm not in a position to tell you how that line was chosen or drawn. Now I want to come back to the question of someone. One of the things that I would argue emerges reasonably clearly in the way Augustine talks about his relationship with this woman. He speaks about her very, very briefly, and it's clear that he feels he needs to mention her, but he doesn't want to go into detail, possibly to spare her the humiliation of being discussed, among other reasons. There's been some really interesting work on this woman in the last few years. A wonderful article by Margaret Miles. I've written an article which I've now retracted some of what I said, because when I wrote the original article, I was influenced by the modern scholarly literature that tends to assume that she was a free concubine. But as I've kind of gone back and back to this text, I am more and more believe that the likelihood is that she was a slave, but not Augustine's own slave. I think she was a slave of the household and probably belonged to his mother. And I think if you take that hypothesis, it has the advantage of explaining a number of things. One, it fits very well the way he talks about his mother engineering a marriage for him that would require him to repudiate the concubine. It fits the fact that he talks passively about her being torn from his side. He exonerates himself from agency, which I don't think he could get away with if he were her owner. Um, and, um, and I also think it makes sense of why his son remained with him. If she were a free concubine, the son would have been more likely to return with the mother to Africa when the mother was sent back, because she would have a free father in whose custody the child would belong. It's possible that she did have a free father and that there was some deal was cut believing that it was in the child's advantage to stay with the father. That is possible. But there's another reason to think that, that someone was a slave, and that is the theme of domestic violence and anxiety about slave-mistress relationships in the text. And I think the most psychologically compelling hypothesis, and here I'm afraid I'm really talking as a novelist, not a historian. It's a hypothesis that's attractive and fits the evidence, but I can't prove it. But I think the most compelling hypothesis, in speaking as a novelist, is that when Augustine is talking earlier in chronologically in the narrative, it's actually in a later chapter, about his mother's difficulties with the slave women of her husband's household. I think it's almost certain that the violent father was abusing these women sexually, at least, you know, some of them. And I think there's a kind of novelist sense in the mother insisting on the slave mistress being removed from the household before a 12-year-old bride is brought in. I think the kind of parallelism between the mother's experience and the situation of the unnamed bride that Augustine is betrothed to by the mother. And remember, it's the mother who chooses the 10-year-old that she wants him to marry. And I suspect, and again, I can't prove it, that there's a sort of deal cut between Monica and the child's parents, that I'm going to protect your child from what happens to most of us when we marry. I'm going to keep Augustine from doing that to this girl. Remember, Augustine's marrying up. He's marrying an heiress. He's from a modest provincial family. So it's an appealing and kind of creepy hypothesis, but I like it. Okay, finally, I'm going to turn to Maxima of Tharbracca, modern Tabarka, which is the A on the map on the north coast of Africa, what was then Africa Proconsularis, what is now Tunisia. And this is a slave heroine who is, I want to say, concocted in light of some of what we've seen before. Particularly, you have to remember that Perpetua and Felicitas are the great female saints of North Africa in the 5th century when the story of Maxima is written. Because I'm drifting rather later than many people in early Christianity are familiar with, let me just briefly give the situation of Victor of Vida. He's a writer in the late 400s, and he's writing after about 40 to 50 years of Africa having come under Vandal kings. Africa's invaded from 430 to 439. It's invaded by the Vandal armies, who set up their own kingdom using Latin language and Roman law. And I think they really see themselves as usurpers who are really just trying to parlay themselves up into emperors of the southern provinces at a time when the empire is fragmenting. The east and west have already fragmented. There's an emperor in the west and an emperor in the east. But in the case of the Vandals, for a variety of reasons, They're eventually unsuccessful, and in the 530s, roughly 100 years after their kingdom is established, the emperor of the East in Byzantium sends the general Belisarius to invade Africa and reclaim it for Rome. In the 480s, one of the things that, that becomes a kind of prelude to what will eventually be the War of Invasion 50 years later is a kind of agitation on the part of the Roman Latin-speaking Catholic population of the country, and they've been under Latin-speaking Vandal Arian domination for 50 years at this point. During the second 50 years of the Vandal Kingdom, the Roman Catholics really start to produce a literature of resistance to the Vandals as barbarian heretics who simply shouldn't be there. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that this was a little bit shrill, that in fact the Vandals were doing a perfectly good job of running North Africa in the same way that the Visigoths ran Spain for a few hundred years, again very successfully, and again using Roman law. But one of the things that Victor of Vita, who's the great agitator of this Catholic movement, does is to construct narratives of Catholic martyrdom in the face of barbarian brutality, barbarian heretical brutality. And one of the stories that he tells that has a strangely influential afterlife is the story of the Ancilla, and that's a slave servant, Maxima, who is given as a slave concubine to one of the dependents of a Vandal warlord, Millenarius. So the Vandal warlord, having conquered, having been apportioned estates that had been taken from a Roman landowner by the Vandal king, he has a loyal armefactor, a man who makes his swords, and he says, here, there's a beautiful slave girl, I'm going to give her to you because you're just such a great swordsmith. What happens in the story is that Maxima, the beautiful slave girl, converts the swordsmith to ascetic Christianity, using words very similar to those that will later be borrowed from her by Saint Cecilia. And this is really the genesis of a whole hagiographical tradition about the sort of wedding night conversion where a woman says to her husband, you know, I'm so sorry, but I'm already married to Jesus. But the idea in the case of Maxima is that it's not just Christian virginity, although she is a professed virgin at this time. You know, smart thing to be if you're a slave, frankly, is to, you know, to get into a position where the clergy have some moral obligation to protect you from sexual abuse. You know, even that modest idea that they might respect your physical person and protect it. But the way that Maxima is used as a kind of heroine of indignation, she's in this narrative, the warlord's indirect abuse of her by using her sexuality in this way, and then her faith kind of standing up again and resisting the impending sexual abuse, is really quite striking, and as I said, has a long afterlife in Christian hagiography. But it also, I think, encapsulates a way that Christian writers in this period were starting On the one hand, they are resisting the Vandal kingdom. So again, this idea of resisting the alignment of state and domestic authority, but also, and here's a slide taken in Tabarka of a pavilion that actually, I think it's a kind of drinks pavilion by the beach. But I love this slide because Tabarka, as it happens, was one of the great monasteries of late Roman Africa, and it was one that that became a conduit of of texts being exchanged back and forth across the Mediterranean between Italy and North Africa during this period. And I think that the importance of monasteries and of ascetic stories about heroes and heroines resisting the sort of evil requirements of the lay powers really was one of the ways that that Latin Christianity created its kind of cultural toolkit that allowed it to be as successful as it was. Ironically, it was not successful in Africa, and largely, I would argue, because the Catholics who were trying to resist the local Vandal kings ended up helping Justinian and his general Belisarius to invade North Africa in the 530s in a way that essentially destroyed the infrastructure of Roman Africa and made it far more vulnerable to eventually being sundered from the Roman Empire by the Arab conquests. So ironically, North Africa, which is the crucible of Christian Latin culture from the late 7th century, becomes a region in which Christianity survives until the 13th century, but the crucible of Christian culture, it's all exported from monasteries like Tabarka up to Italy, and Africa really becomes a Muslim continent. I'm just going to conclude by reminding you of the book Band of Angels, partly because the publishers have sent a bookseller to try to get you interested in some copies, so I want to make sure that you notice him as we go out. But also, I wanted to call your attention to some of the things that I've been doing on the web, again trying to just create a bit of, I don't know, space for people to find out about the kinds of things that that scholars are doing in our sort of area. And I would love it if people would you know, comment on the website, or also to make me aware of resources that you are building or involved with. And I think with that we can open to questions if you have them.
Let me say something
Yeah.
quickly. We do have a reception too.
Yeah.
We don't have time for questions, but you would be willing to sign some of those books, I bet.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, I would love to. So, if you're interested, whether you've bought a book or I saw one or two people actually have them, which I thought was so charming. I would be to just come up to me in the reception. I won't do like a sitting at a table thing because I think it's kind of pretentious for a small group. But I would be delighted to be approached.
Or if
and
you already own
yeah,
a book, she'll sign
yeah,
one,
yeah.
but you
No,
don't have to
exactly.
buy one.
Yes, yes. Or I mean, I'll also sign your cast if you have a cast. No, yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
I'll let
Yeah.
you fill the questions if you want.
Yeah, no, that's great. If there, yeah, good. No, I've said it all. No, yeah,
I've got a question.
Yeah.
With these stories,
Yeah.
sort of, I think in your book, Jorgen, was sort of acting as a teacher.
yeah,
Somewhat.
yeah.
We have characters like Maximum, all
Mhm.
those Mitchell, for the most part.
Uh-huh.
leadership.
Uh-huh.
But part of that, I think, is, aren't they rejecting also sort of like society's values, such as getting married? How does that
Uh-huh.
work in stories like that? Where
Mm-hmm.
here we have these stories of,
Yeah.
here, be like these great women who are now Christians and they're heroines, but
Yeah.
part of that is undercutting something that really sort of basically built the Roman Empire, too.
Yeah.
You're not
Yeah.
going to get married and
Yeah.
have kids and-
Yeah. I mean, it's a really interesting question because I have a feeling that there are a couple of different sort of sociological frameworks for how people use stories, one of which is, you know, the story where if you're telling a bedtime story to a child, it always has the character becoming sleepy at the end of the story. You know, it's like, you know, it's all the stories that are sort of about modeling desired behavior. But I think there is a second set of stories, and of course it's terribly difficult to tell which is which. There's a second set of stories that are about modeling exemplary behavior that you're not expected necessarily to follow. And with the stories of virgins and martyrs, there was actually a debate in the 5th and 6th centuries about, are we putting forth these virgins and martyrs because we want people to be, you know, virgins and or, you know, get themselves killed? And, you know, and people like Gregory the Great actually say, you know, it's not about being like them in every aspect, but it's about learning from them. So that's one of the answers. But I think also one of the things I have been kind of surprised by for me, the task of writing Band of Angels was sort of having done specialist studies of different questions here and there, trying to, you know, pull it together to make a kind of big picture sort of discussion. And one of the things I was really shocked by was how little asceticism featured if I moved the focus away from specialist debates in the historiography towards just looking at the primary sources and kind of trying to make a mosaic that was a little bit less directed by scholarly questions. And I've come to think that one of the reasons for that is that the transmission of the narratives that we have from the ancient world, of course, was through monasteries. That's how we have any literature from the ancient world except for what survived in the sands of Egypt, from which we have very, very few complete texts. We mostly have fragments. You know, so our complete texts are, you know, 90-something% from medieval monasteries just copying and copying again, and you know, and one copy starts to fall apart, so you make a new copy by hand. And those texts have a very, very clear acquisitions policy that libraries give priorities to things that are going to be valuable for teaching teenage boys to be happy away from their families, supporting the rights and privileges of abbots and bishops, and supporting theological views that are relevant to whatever controversies the monastery might be interested in. They're not librarians in our sense of the word. You know, they're not trying to let you understand what the ancient world was like. They're collecting proof texts for their own controversies, and they're collecting material that's going to be useful for running a monastery. So the fact that we have a disproportionately high quantity of texts that have ascetic protagonists, I think has nothing to do with the ancient world. I really think it's about medieval acquisitions policies, which puts us in a difficult position. But classical historians think that we probably have about 4% of ancient literature. You know, so in that sense, you can say from a faith perspective that it's providential, that, you know, God chose what was going to get kept. But one of the things I've been interested by is if you look at the papyri and you look at the little bits and pieces here and there, there seems to be this kind of undertow of people having comparatively normal lives. Yeah? Yeah?
So why, you might have already kind of answered this, but I guess why do you think it is that so many laypersons, just the average person, is completely unaware, I guess, of all these contributions from Africa and early African Christians and so forth, even though, even in certain scriptures, you'll see references to Africa and so forth
Yeah.
here and there,
Yeah.
but there's virtually no, just for the average person, there's not really.
Yeah, people just don't even know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of glossed over or not mentioned at all. They're
Yeah,
kind of unaware
yeah.
of it.
Yeah. I mean, fundamentally, I think it's kind of creepy human nature that, you know, that people are, they're trying to support the powers that be. And I think even the, you know, the good people are kind of trying to fit in with what they perceive to be the polite dominant discourse, you know, and kind of trying to not cause trouble. And but also, I don't know. I've been watching on the web. There's a real phenomenon of I've been watching female agency getting elided, but I'm pretty sure that you take voices that are not from the kind of dominant white male class, be they color or religious traditions or whatever. And I think there's a phenomenon of non-dominant voices really actively being, again, not necessarily actively in a bad intent sense, but just in a sense of how the traffic works. And I will give you a self-aggrandizing example, which is that this coming weekend, on Sunday night, there's a CNN series called Finding Jesus. And this week, they're going to do a chapter from Band of Angels. And but the story that was about Helena and the true cross, the Empress Helena, mother of Constantine. But so the story already, as it was developing, it was becoming more and more the cross and Jesus and the men and whatever. And Helena's still in the story. But as I have this week, I checked because I'm watching this kind of stuff. Does the Empress Helena appear even on the kind of pre-stuff that they're circulating? And it is all pictures of men looking up at the cross. And it's, you know, and it's just crazy. And I know, and I was thinking, I really am, I think, going to like do a formal interview of the guy who's running the PR for this. I really think that he probably has done, you know, market research to discover that women will watch it if they see a picture of men. Whereas if they saw a picture of the Empress Helena, they say, oh, that's about women, you know, that's a specialty interest. And, you know, I believe the dynamics with African American issues are different, that there's more of a groundswell of people knowing that it's interesting, but I don't know. Yeah.
So is it a given that most of the text that we're getting from this time comes from the monastery?
They're being copied by the monasteries, so which means that they've been selected for survival by the monasteries, but they're not necessarily all originally written by the monasteries. Yeah.
But as far as our access to what's going on
Yeah, exactly. So we're dependent on the medieval monks in a way that's really scary.
So
You know.
There's nothing that shows what the average person was thinking during that time, the average lay person.
Except the papyri. But even there, like, you know, that deposition that I showed you where the woman has gone to the bishop to get help. Even there, I talked to a friend who's a legal historian, a woman who used to work in family court, and she said, oh, I see all the rhetorical tricks that you would use if you were trying to sideline a man here. You know, and it's like, oh my God, this is an actual papyrus from the 4th century. And she's saying, I can't trust it. So, you know, that's bad.
So like no personal diaries, nothing.
The closest we have to a personal diary is that text from Perpetua, which is just her diary from the period in the prison. But you were outside. But yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. She'll tell you about it. It's really good. Yeah, yeah.
I think that, I mean, I'd put money I don't have on the idea that people be shocked to hear that the earliest Christianity started in North Africa. You know, I mean, I still get blown away thinking of the scope of the Roman Empire. It's not, it wasn't really in Rome.
Yeah.
Which is odd
Yeah.
to me still.
Yeah.
But can you expand a little bit more
Yeah.
on just historically why or how you think that early Christianity did evolve out of Northern Africa at that time, rather than elsewhere?
Mm-hmm.
And at the time it did.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, if you look at the first attestations we have for Latin-speaking Christianity, and there is Greek-speaking Christianity from the 2nd century in France and Italy attested, that we've got writers attached to the city of Lyon and the city of Rome, but writing in Greek. So, but at that time, writing in Latin, we only had people in North Africa, and but in North Africa and in Rome, the dominant language is Latin. It's just that Christianity hadn't expanded beyond the Greek immigrants. It would be like if I now lived in France and, you know, the people in the Kate religion are only talking English. If you see what I mean, it's like an immigrant religion attached to the language of the immigrants, but it hasn't expanded outward. So it's really interesting that somehow in Africa somebody, you know, went to Africa and got the Africans going, you know, because they're not. I mean, in Judea, where, you know, Jerusalem, and Galilee, where the original Christian group were, they're speaking Aramaic, and, you know, at best there are Jews who also speak Greek, but Latin is really, that's an indigenous language of the Western Empire. So obviously somebody traveled west, or some Africans were in the east and went back. And what we do know that Carthage, where the first Christian writers came from, was a fantastically cosmopolitan city. It had been under Roman domination since 146 BC, but before that it had been a Phoenician center, and it had been a colony from the Phoenicians in the Levant. So there's this connection back to the Phoenician lands, which I think explains probably how the message came from the Middle East to Carthage. And then Carthage is this incredible melting pot. But there are also some really interesting things about Phoenician and indigenous Berber culture that scholars have tried, and so far they've kind of tried and failed, to really encapsulate, because what's distinctive about the African piety as coming from Phoenician and Berber roots. Partly the problem is we have very little writing from the Phoenician and Berber cultures. So in that sense, you're sort of saying, well, there's something distinctive that's emerging there, but we don't know exactly where it comes from. But it is distinctive. African Christianity, by comparison to Eastern Christianity in this early period, it's distinctive for its passionate piety. It's distinctive for its obsession with ethical questions. It's very influenced by Stoicism and by the idea that people have to really live by their ideas in a kind of heroic way, or else they're just not worth much. And those ideas are, you know, the writings of Tertullian of Carthage and Cyprian of Carthage, who's around 250, they wrote a lot of theological stuff that's different, but their most influential writing was writing about Christian ethics that was still being used as, you know, good, useful, in kind of still current 1,000 years later. So, you know, so I think what I don't know is how significant those actual individuals were, or just whether they were tapping a cultural thing. I don't know. But I think, so the answer is that it's because they were so good at it.
And that's a good ending
We can continue this
Yes,
in
no,
the
yes,
in the
yes.
reception. We got to get.
Yeah.
get rid of all